Good evening, Hamden Action Now. It is Saturday night, and we're here to talk about early voting. On November 8th, we're having a statewide election. As you all know, we have an election. We're electing a governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, secretary of the state of Connecticut. We're also have Senate races, races for Congress. But this year, we have a really special treat on our ballots. We have a ballot question on early voting. And I have former state representative Ken Green to come back tonight to talk about what does that mean, what to look for, and how it's going to affect everybody based on how this ballot question, what the results of it will be. Whether we say yes, we're going to allow the General Assembly to make adjustments to our state's constitution, or no, we don't. Around early voting. So we're going to be hearing more from former state rep Ken Green. He is a champion for our democracy and for voting and the voting rights here in Connecticut. So stand by, and we're going to talk more and hear from him tonight. Good evening. How are you, Mr. Green?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, and welcome back. Welcome back. We're here to talk about that ballot. Remember, we talked last time. We were talking about how, we were waiting for the question to come out. What was it going to look like? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about this ballot question, this statewide ballot question that's going to be happening on November 8th. And for those who may have already voted absentee, they've already seen it.
Well, I think that's what I think we have to figure out. What you're right. If you voted absentee, you've already seen the question, and that's going to be interesting because I think that with the question, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen just because the question's on the ballot. It's got to get passed. I haven't done the research to figure out. We had talked about this before, whether or not it's just a majority that needs to vote for it, or 2/3 of those who vote for it has to do it. I think we just have to get clearer on that. And hopefully one of the callers or somebody, Secretary of State, maybe one of the Secretary of State candidates may call in or add in the chat, whether or not, even though the question's there, do you need simply a majority of the people who answer the question in the affirmative, that it then goes to the legislator to be decided upon? And basically, even if the vote passes and it meets the minimum requirements, it will go to the state legislator, who will, in the next session, confirm the vote and then pass legislation that, in fact, we can change the Constitution to have it.
So this question basically is the beginning of the process. It kind of signals the legislature to say that, yes, the voters are interested in early voting. Am I correct in thinking that's kind of how this is moving?
That you're correct. And I think we just have to clarify, and hopefully, like I said, maybe somebody who's listening, Secretary of State, and I didn't get clear on that in terms of whether or not it's a 2/3 of the people who vote for the question have to pass it, or simple majority. So we want to clarify that. I want to say it's a simple majority based on the way it's written. But a lot of times with the constitutional amendments, there's a higher threshold of the number of people that has to affirm the question than just a simple majority. Because again, you're changing the Constitution of the state of Connecticut, and you really don't want to do that, without really it being a clear voice of the people of the state that that's what they want to happen. And if it does pass by whatever the minimum requirements are, you're right. It then goes to the legislator, and then it won't be effective until 2024.
Hmm. Now, and see when it go see, that's the question that people have been asking me. They're saying, so, oh, if I vote yes for early voting, do we just automatically get to vote early next year in our municipals? And I was like, no, no, I don't think it's quite that simple. I think that we're going to have to wait and see. Now, here's the good news. Um, Representative Stephanie Thomas is coming to talk with me tomorrow night at 6:30. So
Okay.
we'll ask her, and if you want to tune in here on tomorrow night, I'm going to ask her what is the process so we can be clear at the polls, because a lot of folks are going to be standing at the polls, and encouraging people to not forget to take in consideration this question. But again, we need to be clear on what happens next.
Yeah, if you allow me to come in tomorrow at 6:30, yes, I would love to be part of that conversation, because we want to ask those questions. We want to be clear on what's the threshold to make it, what's the process after that, when will it
Mhm.
become effective. I think the other thing that um, I'm not sure of, and I think that again, Ms. Thomas, we can ask, is that different states count the ballot, whether it's early voting, absentee voting, same day voting. They count the ballots differently. Some states with the early voting will actually uh, count the ballots on the day that they're turned in. So there's
Mm.
basically a running tab. There's some states that says no, we don't do that. Uh, on the day of election, when basically it's election day, at the
Mhm.
end of that day when the polls close, that's when we begin to count all ballots. Now, currently in the state of Connecticut, with the absentee ballots are now, even though they're coming in now, they're not
Right.
counted until the
No.
election night.
Yep. And that's what happened last time in 2020, because we had a huge number of absentee ballots that came in, weeks before, because they had sent them out and we were able to get them, like, I think it was almost a month in advance of the
30,
election,
yeah.
but we didn't know what the count was until election night. So let's make sure we ask these questions tomorrow, because she would be really, Representative Thomas would be really great to answer those questions so everybody's clear, and we can go back and watch this video later on and make sure that we're all clear, and I want to make sure everybody understands what this process is, because this is a very important constitutional amendment. Because another question that's been coming up is how early, when,
Right.
where, and that has to be decided, I believe, by the legislature. Once we get this, if it passes, like you said, depending on what the number of the pass is, then there has to be a decision made on how early and
Hmm.
when, where do you go to town hall? Do you go? Is there going to be, is going to be election booths set up all over your town or your municipality? So we don't even know what the specifics are yet. And how early could you vote? A month early or 6 weeks early? And these are the questions that I hear. So we
Let,
don't
let,
know
let,
how
let me
early.
let, let me ask you, because I haven't talked to a lot of people about this. I've talked to a very limited few. Uh, a lot of people that I talked to had not really been paying attention to this issue, and they wasn't necessarily concerned about early voting. A lot of times it's been, well, I am going to vote. I'm going to vote on election day, and of course that's what we're used to, and we're not used to early voting. But what have you heard in terms of, do people like it, don't like it? What do you think? Because I generally like the concept and like the idea, and I support it. But I also think that we have to make sure that we do some research on it, some evaluation on it, because what's the purpose of it? It's the idea, which generally I think is that we want to increase the amount of people who actually turn out and vote. We want to increase that
Yes.
percentage of people that are registered to vote. And so I think it would be very important to know over time, does it do that? So, because one, we want to increase voter participation. You do that by looking at, well, how many people voted. And I would hope that if this happens, we monitor the um, the voting turnout for a number of years, because there's always a drop in the number of voters on non-presidential years,
Hmm.
non-statewide years, and when it's just local. So what effect does that happen? Hopefully, during those quote off years, we're going to see just as great a participation and voter turnout as it will be in the presidential. I think that's what be one of the main goals we want to do. We want to see. The other thing I think we want to see is that more participation. I'm hoping from those who generally have felt disenfranchised from the voting and electoral process, that more young people, more urban folks, more folks of color um, vote. We want to see those percentages increase. I think that's another goal that we want to see, more participation. If we don't see those things, then I think that uh, I would still support early voting, but I still think we have to look at why aren't people voting?
Yeah, and there is, I mean, there's like over 500,000 folks that didn't registered people that didn't vote in 2020. And I'm not too sure, and such a good point to make. I'm not too sure how much outreach has been done to reach those folks and find out why didn't they go out to the polls? Why didn't they cast their vote in 2020? And then we also have to look at, as a country and as a state, why did we celebrate such record breaking high voter turnout in 2020 when still 500,000 people didn't vote, registered? And we still continue. I mean, I'm saying I hear a lot about, voter registration drives and things like that, but I never hear a lot about voter engagement drives. I'd love to find out what has happened. And I think we assume that it's like the access is a problem because it's all on one day. You only have that little window of time, from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. And that this can maybe be addressed through the early voting legislation change. But as you said, we don't know. I don't know how much research has been done or even outreach.
Mm-hmm. Well, and plus, when you states that have done that before, who currently have that process available to them, it'd be interesting to see what's the voting trends are like. The other thing I think that if this passes and we have it in Connecticut, how might that change a campaign timeline? How might that change how people campaign? Will it affect folks? I probably, and again, if the bill passes, then the legislative body has to go in, like you said, and decide when it's going to be 30 days before it's going to be 2 weeks. Where do they vote? How do they vote? I think those are very important questions that we have to make sure that we know, because one of the things I would hope that doesn't happen is that a lot of people vote early. Let's say we decide as a state that we're going to, I don't know how you do it, but let people know what the trend is for the candidates, that this candidate is leading by 50% of the vote or 55% of the vote based on the early voting. And I probably wouldn't want to know that before the election day, because then some folks who had not voted may make conclusions about, oh, the race is already over. Oh, this is already done. I'm not going to go out and vote. So what is the legislative body, the General Assembly, is going to decide how they're going to inform the public how the voting's going.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably in the beginning err on the side of we're not going to count even though it's going to be a lot of ballots to count on election day. We're not going to count the ballots until election day, because I would not want to discourage people from saying, oh, my candidate's already won, I don't have to vote. My candidate's
Mm-hmm.
already lost, I don't, so I think we have to kind of think about that. I think that's probably going to be part of the debate that happens.
I agree. And I think that those are some really good points, because I just saw on CNN today where they showed that the rate of early voting that's happened in the early voting states thus far. And it
Mm-hmm.
showed like a pie chart, and it said that, 47% of the Democrats have already voted, 33% of the Republicans. I'm just throwing these numbers out. I can't exactly remember.
Right,
But
right.
like you said, it said, the yellow, it had about 12% of the independents had already voted early. And, it will affect campaigns too,
Yeah.
because, if you see those kind of numbers and you say, wait a minute, 47%, we know we're already, the Democrats are already ahead. They've already gone to the polls. And like you said, it would, you would probably want to adjust your message, I would think, if you're campaigning in that area and you already see those numbers. So there's a lot to consider with the early voting change. And it's just, you know, I wanted to have this conversation tonight because it's going to be very complicated to roll it out, I think. Even though we want it, but it's still going to have to be carefully thought out.
It's going to have to be carefully thought out. And I'm always of the opinion that, especially when it's not new in other states, but it would be new to us, that you monitor it for a number of years and you give the public some feedback on what you find out. Does it increase voter participation? What are some of the difficulties that people may have even in voting early?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any problems in how they do it with either the way the ballot is done? Is it a paper ballot? Do they go, like you said, do they go somewhere? How do we protect if someone vote 10 days before the election? How do we protect that vote that's already been cast for those 10 days? Where's the security at? Where will they
Right.
be housed? Will it be housed in each town? What kind of security each town have to take for that? How do you monitor that with either surveillance and security and video? So there's a lot of things, I think, in terms of the practicality of operating this kind of process that you have to put in place. And I really think that it's more than just say this is going to allow people to have better access to voting, which is great because we want to do that. But there's also, I'm hoping, some goals that we're trying to reach with this
Mm-hmm.
policy that we're having.
Yeah, it's got to be strategic because just saying you can roll in there early, um, and then not, doing anything more. And I venture to say it's probably going to cost towns more money.
Mm,
That's always a problem too, because they're going to have, staff that are going to have to be, for example, if you come to here in Hamden, and you want to open up the polls early and you can come vote early, then that means that the registrar of voters office or the town clerk's office may have to
mm.
have later hours, which means you're going to have to pay people to, it gets, all that has to be considered, if you're going to have those, because right now I can vote absentee because of the special exemption regarding,
Mm-hmm.
the fear of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to go during business hours. I have to go between 8:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or 4:30 here, to show them my ID, get my ballot, fill it
Mm-hmm.
out, sign the envelope, and hand it back to them. I mean, I could do that now, if I wanted to. But are we going to do something different when
Well,
we do early voting?
I think you raised a good question, and I think this is another question we have to ask the Secretary of State candidate, Ms. Thomas, is that the cost, how much it's going to cost, who's going to bear the brunt of those costs, what are we going to expect from the local municipalities in terms of the cost that they're going to have. Now, in just thinking about it, just I thought as you were speaking that, you know, the Citizens Election Program, the public finance for campaigns,
Yes.
take some of that money, and
Yes.
use some of that money. And what I would do if I was a legislator, I would look at reducing. I would actually look at reducing the amount of money candidates get to run for office, and put some of that money into actually better access for the people to have to vote for the candidates. So
I
I
agree.
would reduce theirs because I'll be honest. I've always had some difficulty with, for example, a state senate candidate getting close to $100,000 to run for a campaign that only pays $40,000. So you're gonna give them twice. You're gonna give them twice as much money to run for an office that pay half the amount. So I'm not saying don't give them anything. I'm just saying if you have a method to fund the citizens election program, look at the cost for having an early voting and
Mhm.
possibly take funds out of that, because I don't necessarily want to look at cutting any other human services funding and education funding. I wouldn't want to
Mhm.
cut any funding to pay for this. When we have a program that pays for candidates, I think that's the way you have to look at the budget. Well, because if the question comes, how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah.
Uh, Something may get cut. Taxes may get risen. I don't want taxes to
I
rise.
don't want taxes going up.
I don't want programs to get cut. So that's another question I think have to be asked. How are you going to pay for it? Is this going to be is the cost going to be borne by the citizens? I'm not so sure the citizens will be ready for that. And again, that's the part of the question that's part of the policy that's being promoted that people may not be asking.
Right.
Who's going to pay
Right.
for this?
Right.
Because we like the idea of early voting to increase the citizens' ability to have access to elect their public official is a sound policy to want to have. But it's it's more than just having a sound policy. When you get into the practicality of the operation of something like that, then you have to ask those kind of questions.
I mean, there is a lot to consider. And I mean, here in Hamden, our taxes are off the charts. So we cannot, find anything in our budget to pay for overtime and things like that. And I think that, like you said, that citizens election program would be a brilliant way to, because that seems to go up every year. You notice that, right? Like it goes, the amount of the grant funds seem to go up every year. I'm like, so if we can just halt the increases, and let everybody work with their within a certain parameter of money, and like you said, take that pot and give it to the towns and let them take those monies and use it. I mean, why aren't we using? And it's really shameful. I'm going to get on my little soapbox for a minute here, because the towns don't, we just don't even have a lot of money invested in our election process. Our registrar of voters here in Hamden is like part-time. I think it's only like 3 hours a day. So, and this is just a small window that you can, I mean, not that it's anybody's fault. It's just, that's kind of like the culture. We spend so much money on so many other things in our communities, but we don't spend a lot to even pay our registrar of voters and the registrar's office staff, for all the work that they do to even pull off these elections, and the town clerk's office.
Mm-hmm.
They do a lot. I can't even imagine the work that they do. And like, we're a town of 66,000 and I think about 33,000 registered voters. I can't imagine like a Hartford or New Haven or Bridgeport or Stanford or, some of those large cities. And, still they're running on these little shoestring budgets on an action, activity that is so important to our democracy. So I think that even needs to be looked at in the long run, on how we can help support, to really finance these departments, these registrar voters and the town clerks around our elections a little bit more. They need more support, I think.
Yeah. Well, I would agree. I would agree with you. When I was in the General Assembly, the State Association of Registered Voters would come to us all the time with specifically those questions that you just outlined. Funding. If you want us to do these kind of things, how are we going to get funded? We don't really have those in our budgets outside. We're not Hartford, we're not Waterbury, we're not Bridgeport. So we have we need to really look at how we're funding them. And I think that, again, if you're going to have public monies, for example, I had always thought that, again, I support some aspects of public financing. I really do. But for example, if you have a candidate that's unopposed in the primary and unopposed for the general election, should they be eligible to get the full funding of the Citizens Action Elections Program? If I had no opponent, I'm secure 100% to win. I don't have opponent. I didn't have a primary. I actually have no opponent in November. Now, I'm eligible to get the public finance if I get so many small donors and so much amount. I can get that money. My question would be, should that amount that you get be reduced because you have no opponent? Yes, you still should reach out to your constituents. You still should have the ability to have some funding. You can still raise money, but should you get the full amount, you're guaranteed to win.
You have no opponent.
You're guaranteed to win. You're guaranteed to win. If I'm running for state senate, I'm guaranteed to win. Do I now need $100,000 of public monies to run a campaign? Maybe because I have no opponent, that gets reduced to maybe half of that or something like that. And then the other monies, like you said, I would agree that you might look at the citizens election program. How is that funded? And then you look at, if we have this early voting, could some funds be shifted to that? If you look at registered voters and town clerks in terms of managing elections, could some funds do that? And so maybe you look at the elections in those three areas: monies to the candidates, monies to run for the election, monies for the towns to pull off this election.
To
And
pull them
then
off,
if we,
yes.
yeah, and then if we have early voting, uh, monitoring that process, putting some extra monies in that, so that we can really look at that over 3 to 4 year period, with some real evaluation of how it's really working in Connecticut.
I agree. I mean, that is such a I always wondered about that. It's like, okay, if you're running unopposed, why? Right? So why? Um, I mean, I totally agree. And there are funds available in these in that program to help support the towns. The towns struggle with this process. And if we have to, we want early voting, I think we should make the investment to support the towns
Yeah.
and their people, so they can have the resources to be able to really have a fair and safe, a safeguarded election. And we wouldn't have to worry about having to find the money in the town. The towns are already, every town I know is strapped for money. The cost of running school systems and police departments and fire departments are costing a lot of money nowadays. I mean, it just, they don't have the money. But this is also equally as important. So I think we need a different conversations on all fronts, on many of these items. And I hope that this can pass so we can at least start having these discussions in the General Assembly, and we can, hopefully, public comment would happen. I'd be able to raise my hand and say, here, write a nice, thorough letter and say, please consider these items, and speak to the candidates. Because, tomorrow we will have one of the candidates here. We'll ask her, and maybe she can have these things in place for her consideration.
Yeah, and I would probably suspect that she definitely has thought about these things. That's what the responsibilities of the Secretary of State are, is to think about running clean, effective elections, increasing voting turnouts. When I've seen some of her advertisement in her campaign, she wants to connect with the folks and to do the things we're talking about: increase voter turnout, make sure everybody have access to voting, and that we get young people involved. So these are the things that they're saying. And I appreciate that you're hearing that from the Secretary of State. One of the things we don't do enough is that we should be asking every candidate that's running for office
Mm-hmm.
those kind of questions. And what'll happen is that people that get elected, when this question gets passed, I'm feeling confident that it's going to get passed. If they have that conversation in the General Assembly during the committee hearings and during the House and Senate vote, uh, will the candidates listen to their constituents? Once they're elected, it's harder to maybe have the kind of impact you want than when they're running for office. Now we're coming down to the last 10 days, but
Mm-hmm.
I know that there's a number of representatives in my area that's unopposed. So they don't necessarily have to be asked that question. We haven't had a lot of candidate forums because there haven't been a lot of contested seats. But
Right.
the question, how would they vote? Where's the money coming from? Because it's not just the Secretary of State. As a matter of fact, the Secretary of State is not going to be the one that's going to decide where the money's coming from. The General
No.
Assembly. The General Assembly is going to be the ones that decide where the money's coming from. So when the Secretary of State's office put in their budget around this area, if it passes and they get ready for it, how much money do they need? Where's the money coming from? How are they going to do the safeguards? How are they going to help the municipalities? These are
Yeah.
questions for the Secretary of State, but they're also questions for all the candidates. And we just don't ask the candidates those kind of questions.
Yes. Well, I'm glad we're having this conversation tonight, and we're going to rebroadcast this next week. And I'm going to, we need to make sure, and I'll put it in the chat too. I'm going to go back and retype all these questions so that everybody can't call your candidates up, so you can know where they stand.
Mm-hmm.
So much stuff is done, outside of our daily experience, because we don't know. I mean, I can't sit and watch CTN all day long. I'm at work.
Yeah.
But So we need to ask them what are their plans? How do they plan to address it if it does pass? Which I agree with you. I think we're probably going to get it to pass this time, but we need to know how are we going to address? How are we going to pull this off? How will it be executed? And how is it going to be evaluated? That is a very key point. Once it's done, how are we going to evaluate the effectiveness of it, and how can we go back and maybe amend it later on? Because if it's not as effective as we hoped, we might need to tweak it.
Mm-hmm. Well, what have you heard in terms of like I said, I haven't talked to a lot of people. What are your folks saying about they like it, they don't like it? What do they like about it? What do they think what's going to happen?
Well, everybody likes the people that I've spoken to down here in Hamden and the Newhall Ville area over here in Hamden side. Everybody likes it. Even the people I work with and whatnot. We've talked a little bit about it because it is kind of hard to get there on the same day and beat that 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Some people said it doesn't even see why we even need it. That was a smaller percentage of people that said, I don't have any problem. I can just take the day off. But a lot of people, domestic workers, people that work at Yale and different shifts, they're like, it would actually be really convenient if I can go on a Saturday or if I can go on a Sunday. But then we go back when in my head, I'm saying, okay, so that means that the registrar of voters and the town clerk's office has to be open on a Saturday or Sunday, which yields overtime for the people. So I was
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, that's a great idea, but we have to, again, we go back to the, how do we
Right.
fund it? And most of the people were like, a weekend and an evening would be a better time. So if you can do it 2 weeks in advance and you can go from 6 to 8 p.m., that would be easier. You get out of work, you roll over, you fill out your ballot, you put it in a little thingy and you're gone. But all of that would come with a cost because it would be after hours and things like that. So it's good that people are talking about it and are excited about it. And then I'm excited about the next steps.
Well, I don't know what they do in Hamden, but Hartford schools close on election day. I don't know if that's statewide now. I don't know, but I remember when I was growing up, and even a few years ago, we did not always close schools on election day. And it was funny because I kind of wonder why we didn't at least close schools, because when we so concerned about security of schools and people walking in and out, you have schools that were election polling places, and you had anybody coming in there. So I'm actually is glad that we do close schools for that, but it creates another kind of problem, like you said. Um, do people have time to take off that day? Now, if you have kids at home, and now you got to find babysitters. Some people might bring them to the polling places. So it's on one hand, I like the idea that schools are closed, but on the other hand, we don't know what effect that have on. Well, now that people have their kids at home, do they actually now have more difficulty going to the polls because now they have to
Exactly.
find babysitter and whatever? So these things, they sound good when we think about them, but then we don't go back and see what the real effect of them are. So, like I said, I'm glad that schools are closed, but that's the kind of thing that I think that we have to be a little careful about. Even though you have, if you have early voting, uh, how are we going to measure whether or not who's voting at what days, what times? Do they want weekends? And how are you going to cover this? Uh, these are the kind of questions that, again, we can ask. The General Assembly is going to debate these kind of things. If this passes on November 8th, if that question passes, they'll be debating this. And like you said, it'll be a good time for people to reach out to their local representatives and ask them where they stand, what do they think about this, how are they going to pay for it. And this is also a good time for high schools that have political science classes, colleges that have political science classes, to have their students study this and ask these kind of questions. It'll be a great class assignment from January to June, because this is when the debate's going to happen in the General Assembly.
And what I also was hoping after this whole election happens on November 8th, that Hamden Action now probably early in next year can have a host a in-person forum, where we can maybe have a panel and hear from the community down here. And hopefully you'd be able to come too. We can, talk a little bit more about now that we've gotten, let's see if we can't start working on letting the General Assembly know what we want to see happen, and how we'd like to see it have it executed. And we can invite. I mean, I love to invite our representatives. Hopefully, they'll get reelected on November 8th, and whoever's elected, invite them, have them come on out, and let's have a a in-person community conversation about this, so that everybody they're on the same page and understand what the community wants.
That's a very good idea. In fact, I'm kind of going to steal your idea a little bit, being the political action chair, the Greater Hartford branch of NAACP.
Awesome.
If we do that, we might, who's ever the Secretary of State, who's ever the chairpersons of the committee. Basically, you want to have four people: the minority representatives, the majority chairpersons of the government elections and administration committee. So that's called the GAE. So you have those folks, and then a couple of community folks. And so you have 6 or 7 people on the panel: Secretary of State, the chairmen of the general elections and administration committee, and a couple of community folks, and you have those questions. And I would invite those same folks to a forum up here with a similar forum to address the community up here around that, because you want to do that before they start writing the legislation,
Yes.
making arrangements behind closed doors about what they want, but to expose some of the ideas, have the community say what they want before the legislation is finalized.
Yes, that's why I say the early, right after January. Let's start. We can get this organized and get these forums set up, because they need to hear. Again, that is always what happens before. We say yes on the ballot. Yeah, we want to do this, and then a year later, or 6 months, or 8 months later, something comes out and it's totally different than what the community wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, oh, that didn't work out. And so this is, but what I try to make sure I tell everybody, even though you put your little bubble into that ballot on November 8th, the work as a voter and a citizen is not over when you run that little thing into the machine. It just begins, because if your candidate gets elected, you must continue and engage in dialogue with your candidates and your elected officials once they're in office. It's not over on election day.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. The term engagement, because I think that I always, we have the term when we talk about political empowerment. Well, how do we empower our community? We
Mm-hmm.
empower our community with engagement. The only way
Mm-hmm.
that you are empowered is that if you are engaged, and that's why you opened up the show and talked about voting, in that it's more than just going to vote and then once you're done.
Nope.
We have to be very careful about doing that, because our percentage of votings, especially some of the urban communities and communities of colors, are low. But we have to talk about not only voter registration, but education around in voting, in the process, the political process, engagement, and that's how we become empowered. And so
Mm-hmm.
the one day that we vote is almost just the beginning. It's almost just one day in the process of it. But
Mm-hmm.
engaging to be more empowered is very important. And so, what's happening in some of these committee meetings at the state. And one of the things, and it sounds like what you're doing in Hamden, is that not only in the state, but in the local community, what are you doing? Are you going to town council and city council meetings? Are
Mm-hmm.
you engaging your local folks to pass policies and pass legislation that's important to your town?
Mm-hmm.
Because we talked about this the last time. We have the federal government, and sometimes we have to explain to folks what the federal government, in terms of those elected officials, do and what they're responsible for on the nationwide level. And then our state elected officials, the governor, the state constitutional officers, and then our state senate and our state reps. What are their responsibilities for the state of Connecticut? The responsibilities of the state officers, elected officials, is very different than the responsibilities of those that's elected in New York, those who are elected in Vermont, those who are elected in Michigan. We have state rules, state laws. There's always a big question with the federal Supreme Court about what are the laws of the state versus the laws of the federal government. Who overrides who? The state laws are very important. A lot of times, the things that are the policies and the legislation that's passed at the federal level are implemented through state legislation. And then what happens with state legislation is carried down to the local communities. And so when you talk about the register of voters, town clerks, and whether they have the monies to do something like an early voting, that's where the state going to have to work with the local communities. And that's when your state elected officials going to have to work with your local elected officials. And all of those things are educational things for our communities to engage them so that they feel empowered.
Yes, yes. So it's just so much. And I'm hoping you and I can continue to have these conversations. I would love to do a talk on how an idea can become legislation and how you can take an idea to your legislator and have them create legislation and how it goes from, a bill to a law. And so, because this is things that I'm telling you, I didn't even know about, nobody, we just don't, I haven't taken a civics class, since I can't tell you when I graduated high school a long time ago. But, it's been a long time. And I think that, a lot of people should be really educated on this process because we do have a lot of great communities. The communities are the ones that can solve their problems. But we need the lawmakers, and we need to be able to know how to address our lawmakers, what to tell them, what we need, and how to get them to support legislation to make these changes in our community that we need with regard to, our education, our public schools, our roads, traffic patterns. I'm on the police commission. I'm on the traffic authority here in Hampden. We get, people coming in and, we're policymakers. So we have people that come to our meetings and they want turn signals. They want speed humps. And that's them engaging with appointed officials that were appointed by the mayor. So, this is what engagement looks like. So what my goal has always been for down here in my county, in New Haven County, is to create a forum for citizen engagement with their elected officials and bring up topics that we usually don't talk about or even think about. So, I always tell the story that in 2020, around 10 o'clock in the morning, I went down to the Keefe Center here on Dixwell Avenue. And there's a line wrapped around on election day. It was cold and there was a little drizzle coming down. And I just kind of rolled up and I said, how about all this voter suppression here in Connecticut? And they're like, what are you talking about? There's no voter suppression. And I said, but you're standing out in the cold rain on a work day, waiting to get into a locked building to cast your vote. To hire somebody, really, you're hiring people today and you have to stand out in the cold rain and miss time from work to hire someone. And he was like, I never thought about it like that. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of a little suppressive. So, it's the normal things that we do. We don't really realize that they could be a lot easier or even different, a little bit more convenient, and a lot more accessible. But we don't really talk about it because it's just been the norm for so long. So it's very exciting to me that we even have this question on the ballot. I know we were all involved. You were involved. I was involved in, fighting to even get this ballot question back in last year. So, it's progress in this kind of world, in this universe is incremental. So this is the next this is the next step in this process, but it's very small. And I try to tell people, don't, it doesn't happen overnight, and we have to be patient and take it step by step.
But, engagement, I think, is very important. When I was elected, a couple of things happened, and you've heard this before. When you're a public official and you come around, especially around election time, what's one of the first things people say when an official come around during election time? What's the first thing they say?
I'm not political.
No,
or something.
No. Oh, no. The first thing you hear a lot of times is, oh, we only see you around election time.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
That's one of the first things. You're an elected official and it's election time and you're trying to engage with people. And the first thing they say is that, oh, we only see you around election time.
Right.
And sometimes I used to believe that, and I'm not always sure I believe that now, because being an elected official, I tried to do a couple of things to try to get my community engaged. And similar, I mean, this analogy of similar to like getting parents involved with PTOs in their communities. You're trying to get your constituents involved, and you have these open meetings and these public meetings, and just very few show up.
Yeah, it's
Very
very
few show
hard.
up. So when I first got elected, one of the things that I thought I would do, well, not thought I would do, that I did, and I did it for a couple of years. And I got to tell you, I was disappointed. I would have every 3 months, I would have an open meeting in
Mm,
different parts of the communities to say, come, I'm going to be here at such and such time. Tell me what's happening. Try to outline what my issues was going to be and how I needed them. And then I was trying to, what one of the things I wanted to do, I had some of my campaign volunteers. I assigned them to certain streets, and I created 10 zones in my district to say, you're the captain of this zone. You got to, I went outside the town committee because I didn't feel that they was as effective as you wanted it to be. And I wanted
hmm.
to have more direct contact. So I said, you got to help me get the folks to these meetings. And we worked hard. And outside of the folks that worked with me, it was very, very few. And then when it's re-election time, I'm doing my campaign, and we only hear from you during. So some of
Not
that,
true.
some of that really wasn't true. So you're right. I think that we have to have people learn how to stay engaged, how
Yes.
they need to engage. What we tend to do is we tend to be reactionary. I don't like
Hmm.
something. I don't like a particular policy. I don't like a particular vote of an elected official. So now I'm going to get involved because I'm really reacting because I don't like something. And
Yeah.
I would hope that our folks change that a little bit and say, it's not a matter whether I like the policy or don't like the policy. I want to get engaged. I want to fully
Hmm.
understand the policy. I want to know how it's going to be effective, how it's going to affect me in reality and practicality. And then I want to engage my elected official in that. That doesn't mean that our elected officials should just wait till election time. No, they should do that more. It sounds like you sound like you're a different type of town committee members than the ones that I've had some pleasure of dealing with in the past. They don't necessarily bring the community together, want to engage folks, bring the elected officials to the district, and engage in a conversation about what's best for the community and what's the policies that we want to promote. So that engagement has to change. And so, people like you who are on the front lines doing that, we want to thank you, because that's how we
Hmm.
get our citizens empowered with people like you really working the streets and working with the public.
Yeah, we were down in Mill Rock Park, which is down in New Hallville, in Southampton, a couple weeks ago, a couple weekends ago, and we're just asking people. It was a nice, warm, fall day, and we were just like, so what do you think about, the early voting? And a lot of people didn't know about it. They were like, I don't know what
Right.
you're talking about. Where I said, there's gonna be a ballot question. So then I went to a bunch of, some bunch of kids. They were like, 16, 17 years old, and I was like, you're not able to vote yet, but do what are your plans? Because we need to know if you're going to, we need to get you registered as soon as you turn 18. And, they were like, whatever, so, but I just think that we need to do that. We just need to roll down to the community. We need to stop waiting for the community to come to us. And we have to go to the community, in those spaces. If it's at a park, where, folks hang out, go down there, we just chit chat. We used to do that when I was coming up back in the day. Again,
Hmm.
won't tell you how long ago. We used to always do that kind of stuff. I mean, we would just, hang out. We would be in community together. And now, because of these things like these phones and all these things we have, we don't really, we don't communicate, on a one-on-one basis like we used to, in previous generations. But we, slowly we've got to find our way back there, to really, engage. And that's why I want to do a in-person, not a virtual like we're doing right now, which is nice. But we should get and do some in-person things where there's food and community, and we can be in community together and talk about these things as a community, as a family, and in community. I think that would be really great. And continue those conversations. It can't just be one. It should be every quarter or at least twice a year and have a big one. But we should be in community more.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And it's unfortunate that a lot of times people don't pay attention to the questions on ballots.
No,
Um,
they don't even answer them.
yeah, yeah. And, sometimes there's local communities, towns, and cities that have their own local questions that are
Hmm.
important, referendums. People hear the word referendums, and sometimes they have them on the local level, and people need to pay attention to them. Um, so these are the kind of things that, again, I want to keep going back to engagement, uh,
Hmm.
education, political engagement, and political empowerment. These are words that we throw around and we say that, but how do you do that? And some of the things
Hmm.
that we talked about this evening is, I think, how you do that.
Yeah.
Hold your elected officials accountable by having meetings in the community with updates in terms of what they're doing. Make sure that you communicate with them by email, by virtual, by letters, by phone calls. Uh, you know, let them know how you feel. Register to vote, but then again, go out and vote. And if this early voting happens, uh, don't get too lazy and just keep saying, "I'll do it the next day. I'll do it the next day. I'll do it the next day," and then find out it is the last day. You have that opportunity to do it. Take time to do it. Hopefully, there's going to be less excuses about why they didn't vote. The other thing is that, unfortunately, we have to deal with folks talking about politicians don't do nothing for them anyway. Um,
Mm.
that is very, very, very is incorrect. It's just not true. Uh, Policies on the local level and from the state level have direct impact on your livelihood daily,
Mm.
your daily living. The policies that come particularly from the state levels affect you tremendously, and so
Yes.
we have to know that. Um, I get sometimes disappointed in the turnout of college students. We have a number of college
Yeah.
students. When you leave high school and you go to college, that's when you turn usually from 17, 18. So now you're actually eligible to vote. If you haven't, a lot of high school students, especially if they go to college out of their town, don't register in the town that they go to college in. They actually have an option. You can register to vote in the town that you live in and that you're from, or you can register on your college campus and use that address if you want to be more involved in local politics. So
Hmm.
college students, we should do more. We should have better efforts to register college students and make sure they vote, because that's their first time. The first time I voted was my first year in college because I had turned 18 when I left for college. And so my first vote actually wasn't in Connecticut. It was in Massachusetts, because
Wow.
I was in college in Massachusetts. So I registered in Massachusetts. Um, so I'm not going to tell you when, but the first time I registered and I voted, Massachusetts was the only state that voted for a Democratic governor, or Democratic president. There was one election where only one state voted for this Democratic presidential candidate, and I was in that state when that happened. So that's a little trivia quiz
That's a
to
trivia.
try to
I'm gonna go look that
to,
up.
to try to figure that out. So I was very proud of that at that point. Uh, so, but college, again, empowering college students who
Hmm.
are obviously, in my opinion, they're in college, they're concerned about the education, they're
Hmm.
pursuing their educational goals. They should be very much aware of what's happening with them, for them, in the places where they are, and they should get involved.
Absolutely. I agree. But, we just have to continue to engage and do things just like we're doing tonight. And this is going to show up on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and I think it's also going to be, I have actually a couple uh, um Facebook pages. We have Hamden Action Now public page. We also have Hamden Action Now, which is we have a private group as well. So this will show up on all those. In our private group, we have a lot of one-on-one discussions and things like this. So it's very important to continue to stay in community with each other. We can't know it all or on our own. In Hamden, as you mentioned, there is a referendum question this year on our ballot. We are amending. There's been a whole charter revision process, so where there is a referendum question to accept the amended charter. So you have two questions on the Hamden ballot. So yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. So we have, the statewide ballot question, and we also have a referendum question here as well. So everyone take a look at those questions, and please do not leave them blank. Please make, either however you decide to check them off, please do not leave them blank, because that is really heartbreaking when those referendum questions and the ballot questions are left blank. So thank you so much, Mr.
Well,
Ken
let me
Green.
let me just ask you very quickly. In your Hamden referendum around the charter, are they any drastic, any strong recommendations one way or the other on the charter? What's anything that stands out?
Yes, there. Well, one really big item on the charter revision here in Hamden is to extend the mayor's term from 2 years to 4 years. So that's huge.
Yeah.
That gives you more of a continuity and of governing, as opposed to having to run an election every 2 years. And also there's update to I believe create a civilian review board for the police department, and also have town-wide representation to the police commission and on those boards. Right now, it's just people being appointed, but I think it's going to be a requirement of every section of every district should have representation on these boards. So there's these kind of things that have been changed. Don't quote me on that. Whoever's listening, don't quote me, but I know that those are some of the highlights and the changes to the town's charter. And the charter here, I don't think has been looked at since 2010. So it's
Yeah.
overdue. It's
Since
due.
2010. Yeah. Well, most towns in Connecticut by law has to do it every 10 years. I don't know, and that might be a state uh, legislation, but I know we have to do one every 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
usually they do them every 10. So we're
Yeah.
just a little, I know we started the process a couple of years ago. Then I think, the pandemic got in the way.
Yeah.
And then they had to revive, resurrect it and get it started up. So the commission that was working on it finally finished it. So it's again, if you've already voted early, you've already seen it.
Right.
So I will see it on November 8th because I'll be voting on election day. So there's a lot of things to consider. So that, the ballot to me is a very sacred document because there's so much power in that piece of paper that you get to select the charter is the constitution of a town.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to explain them that's how powerful the charter is. And when you select that you're going to say yes, we're going to amend it, you're essentially it's like amending the town's constitution. So we can't take voting and that ballot lightly. It's a very important process and document, as we can see with all that's been going on since 2020.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. We got to talk again. Let's see what happens on November 8th. And, I'll be
Yeah.
sending you an
I'm
email.
gonna try to join you tomorrow just to sit in
Yes.
and I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Representative Thomas at this point.
Sure.
So just to say hi and maybe just flush out a few of those questions. But thank you, and I appreciate you always allowing me to have a few moments with you.
Thank you so much, and have a great evening. And I will see you tomorrow evening at 6:30.
Okay.
All right. Take care. Have a
Okay.
good
Bye-bye.
night.